Harald Sigurdsson, III of Norway, or Harald Hardråde as was his epithet, the latter roughly translating to a number of contested meanings. Hard ruler, tyrant, ruthless, or tyrannical, is renowned as the last Norwegian king of the Vikings. A well-versed traveller and seasoned warrior, Harald had already fought and lived across the globe, in Norway and Russia, on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, in Iraq and Sicily, before his famously unsuccessful attempt to wrestle Britain from the English king, Harold of Wessex. It was this attempt in 1066 that culminated with the bloody slaughter of over 7,000 Viking warriors at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, including Harold himself, and thus the recognised end of the notorious Viking Age. But who was Harold? How did this formidable Norwegian warrior king meet his gory fate on that field in Yorkshire? And how ultimately did he irrevocably change the course of history? Today we take a look at the infamous last of the Viking warriors. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Young and Exiled. Harald Sigurdsson, born in roughly 1015 to parents Asta Gudbrandsdatter and Sigurdsia, a wealthy and influential petty king. Petty as in governing a relatively small territory or a subdivision of a larger kingdom. I'm not here to comment on his personality, I've never met the guy. Had a largely turbulent youth. His older brother, the violent and unpredictable Olaf Haraldsson II, son of Asta from her previous marriage to petty king Harald Grensk, declared himself king of Norway that same year and would go on to reign for 13 ruthless years. Thus, being the half-sibling of King Olaf, the Fat Stout as he was known, Harald was born into Norwegian royalty. Harald spent much of his youth at the court of his half-brother, educating him with early and crucial exposure to the workings of royalty, governance and policy-making. Under the mentorship of Olaf, Harald honed his skills in iron-fisted leadership, political subterfuge, and Viking military strategy. As mentioned in previous videos, the spread of Christianity influenced many Viking leaders to gradual conversion during the late Viking Ages. King Olaf was one of these fervent Christians and worked tirelessly to convert Norway fully to Christianity. His efforts in Christianization included building a myriad of churches, establishing ecclesiastical structures and monuments, and promoting Christian values, despite his violent tendencies. Influenced by Olaf's dedication, Harald continued to support Christianity in his later reign, particularly so once his half-brother was canonized as patron saint of Norway after his death at the Battle of Stiklestad. Throughout his reign, Olaf battled against usurpers and invaders, eventually being driven into exile. But it was Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, that he would finally be cut down in an attempt to reclaim the throne from Danish King Canute the Great. With an army of around 6,600 men, their rallying battle cry hailed across the battlefield. Fram, fram, Krigsman, Crossman, Konungsman, meaning forward, forward, men of Christ, men of the cross, men of the king. Olaf faced a fearsome force of rivals led by Harak of Tjotta and numbering over 14,000, but at his side was also his half-brother Harald, only 15 years old. Resulting in casualties totaling over 8,000 including the exiled king, the battle was a gruesome defeat for Olaf's army. Harald was severely wounded but luckily managed to escape capture and potential ransom or execution. Assisted by the Earl of Orkney, Rugnevo Bruseson, he went into hiding whilst his wounds healed, now a lonely teenager in exile. The Wandering Warrior. Sweden, Ukraine, Estonia, Bulgaria, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Mesopotamia, Sicily, Italy. Over the next 15 years, Harald Sigurdsson served the nobility and fought as a mercenary in all of these locations. Growing from the exiled young teenager to a fearsome seasoned warrior, gaining great experience of all types of warfare and accumulating immense wealth in wages and captured booty. After recuperating from the wounds suffered at Stiklestad, Harald journeyed across Sweden before finding refuge in To Kievan Rus, modern-day Ukraine, arriving over a year after the battle in 1031. The region was ruled by the powerful Grand Prince Yaroslav I Vladimirovich, Yaroslav the Wise, and he recognized in Harald an asset. During his own exile, Olaf II had found security with Yaroslav some years prior, so perhaps this endeared him to the young 16-year-old who now turned up at his court. Harald was immediately designated a high-ranking officer or commander in Yaroslav's military forces. Presumably, his nobility and providence made up for his lack of actual experience. However, during the time he served Yaroslav, roughly 4 years, Harald amassed a wide range of combat and leadership experience, engaging in numerous military campaigns against both Kievan Rus, neighbouring states, and its internal rebellions. Despite a lack of existing period evidence, historians are fairly certain that Harald would have fought in Yaroslav's war against the Polish in 1031, against the Tudians in Estonia, and the semi-nomadic Turkish Pechenegs, as well as the Byzantines and steppe nomads. Whilst culminating this experience of war and its strategic intricacies, as well as military prominence, Harald also strengthened his ties with the Grand Prince by promising to marry his daughter, Elizaveta, upon his return. Yet, horrifyingly, some historians believe Elizaveta would have only been around 10 years old at the time. From Kievan Rus, Harald headed further east to Constantinople, seeking out service with the Byzantine Empire, and from where he would spend another 8 or 9 years honing his blood-spattered skills. The Varangian Guard. Derived from the Norse var, meaning pledge, the Varangian Guard were an elite unit of the Byzantine army established by Emperor Basil II in 988 as a personal bodyguard. They lasted in strength until the 14th century. Renowned for their ferocity, loyalty, and skill in combat, the Varangian Guard was made up of an eclectic mix of Scandinavian warriors from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Rus from Ukraine and Novgorod, Anglo-Saxons, and Normans. And it was to this unit that Harald and his own 500 loyal soldiers swore fealty to in 1034. Arriving in Constantinople, Harald served the Byzantine Emperor Michael IV, the Paphlagonian. He began naval service in the eastern Mediterranean, fighting against the Arab pirates who plagued the area before moving inland to combat those who supported the pirates in Anatolia, eventually forcing the Arabs out of the region by 1035. Contemporary Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson wrote that Harald was actually the leader over all the Varangians, and at this stage, such was his military prowess and ability, that when they pushed further east towards the Euphrates, Harald participated in the capture of 80 fortified Arab strongholds. Accounts of Harald's heroic exploits during this time are fantastical, bordering almost certainly on the fabricated and even comical, exaggerated and fabled by both his loyal warriors and period Norse chroniclers. Snorri Sturluson claims that during the siege of one garrison town, Harald tied firebrands to the feet of many birds, who once returning to their nests inside the town's walls set it ablaze, forcing these stubborn inhabitants to flee. Sturluson further writes that the Varangians captured another town by tunneling under its walls, emerging in a hall where most of the defenders were feasting, proceeding to slaughter them, or by implausibly stopping to play sports during a siege, lulling the townspeople into a false sense of security as they watched the elite warriors, before they quickly picked up their weapons and charged the town. Following service in Jerusalem, Harald fought his final campaigns with the Varangian Guard in Sicily, attempting to reconquer the island from the Saracens, who'd established an emirate there, and in southern Italy and Bulgaria, quelling bloody uprisings. It was in Bulgaria that Harald earned the barbarous nickname Bulgar Brenner or Bulgar Burner, after employing scorched earth policies that involved burning villages, crops, and resources to deprive the Bulgarian rebels of supplies and shelter. Accounts of Harald's character and personality during his mercenary years paint him in a light perhaps less suited to that imagined of the heroic wandering warrior. Gwyn Jones writes, quote, "He was fierce, resourceful, cunning, resilient, and enduring, but when the occasion called for it, double-dealing, vengeful, and cruel, who lived by rape and war, believed in fame, riches, and power, and employed fair means and foul to obtain them." While Snorri Sturluson gives us also a physical depiction of Harald in his older years, vainly claiming, quote, "Harald was above other men in wisdom and eloquent counsel, and was very skilled with weapons. He was also fortunate in gaining victory, merciless to his enemies, punished all grievances, and was greedy for power and possessions. A handsome and noble man, white-haired with a white beard and long moustache, one of his eyebrows was somewhat higher than the other. He had large and well-developed hands and feet, and was 5 ells tall. However, the death of Emperor Michael in 1041 resulted in a rapid disintegration of Harald's status and opulence. The new Emperor Michael V Caliphates and Empress Zoe Porphyrogentia swiftly had him arrested and imprisoned. Sources that claim to explain his incarceration are surprising and varied. Accusations of embezzlement, being a threat to their political vulnerability due to his popularity, attempting to return to Norway while still in military service of the court, committing murder, defiling an illustria femina, distinguished or noble woman, and even refusing to marry Empress Zoe, who by this stage was close to 70 years old. However, the general consensus among historians is that Harald was imprisoned as a result of both monetary impropriety, drawing attention to the immense wealth and treasures that Harald had amassed during his campaigns. It's possible portions of this may well have been plundered from royal funds in the court's purse, and also the threat he posed to their powerful positions given his popularity with both the people and the previous emperor. Harald was imprisoned in an oubliette, a small vertical chamber with only one entrance, usually a trapdoor located high above the floor, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for prisoners to escape and thus easy to be forgotten. He was alongside two of his lieutenants, Halldor Snorrason and Ulf Osbjörnsson. However, it was not just these two he was supposed to have shared his cell with. Escape. Norse sagas of Harald's incarceration, albeit not the best of sources as previously mentioned, write that the men initially shared their cell with a huge serpent. In some accounts it's a ferocious lion and even a dragon, surrounded by the gnawed bones of its previous victims. In dire straits, the ghost of the late Olaf II, Harald's half-brother, supposedly appeared to the prisoners, showing them where a knife had been hidden in the oubliette's walls, and with which Harald quickly killed the beast. The ghost then simply assisted them to escape, taking the form of a woman who was conveniently Harald's recent love interest, according to some accounts, and lowering a rope into the oubliette and hauling the three prisoners out. As far-fetched as it seems, historian Kelly de Vries believes there may be some truth to the tale, albeit in a more grounded theory than a powerful ghost woman helped them. De Vries thinks perhaps they were assisted by loyal citizens who were in revolt against Michael V. Quickly joining the uprising against the short-lived Byzantine emperor, Harald and his loyal Varangian Guard are said to have assaulted the royal palace. Vandalizing its opulence and slaughtering all opponents, they dragged Michael V from the chapel, where he sought refuge before Harald supposedly gouged the man's eyes out whilst he was still alive. Age 27, Harald again requested he be allowed to return to his native Norway, now having married Constantine IX Monomachus and declared him emperor, strictly refused, leaving the Norwegian no option but to flee. Return to Kievan Rus. Harald and those men who remained loyal from his Varangian Guard hatched a bold plan to escape, recounted in the Norse sagas as being extremely difficult and accomplished only by stealth. In the dead of the night, they first broke into the home of Maria, the niece of Empress Zoe and erstwhile intended marriage partner for Harald, forcibly kidnapping her against her will before rushing away to find ships capable of holding them all. Finding two galley ships moored and unguarded, the fleeing force boarded and began to row into the Bosporus Strait, connecting the Black Sea with the Sea of Marmara, yet it was here they faced a significant challenge. A huge chain known as the Great Chain of the Golden Horn and said to be capable of stopping warships dead in their tracks, had been slung across the length of the strait from Constantinople to the Megalos Peiros, primarily aimed at preventing unwanted ships from entering. Cunningly, Harald had already accounted for this problem, and according to the sagas, he commanded his men to row as hard as they could, and for those who weren't rowing to all move to the stern of the vessel, thus weighing it down and forcing the bow to rise over the great chain. Swiftly, he then commanded them all to rush to the bow, reversing the maneuver and carrying them safely over the chain. However, the second ship wasn't so lucky, breaking its keel on the obstacle and cracking in half, drowning nearly all aboard. Before continuing their journey, Harald stopped to allow Maria off the ship, apparently returning her to Constantinople to, quote, show the Empress how little power she had over him, for in no way could her imperial power keep him from taking her niece. Returning to Kievan Rus in 1042, Harald fulfilled his promise of marrying Elizaveta, daughter of Yaroslav, and also consolidated his immense wealth. During his service in Constantinople, he had been sending back treasures and loot for safekeeping, now owning so much wealth that, quote, no man in this northern land has ever seen its like in one man's possession. King of Norway. Living in Kievan Rus again, Harald bided his time, listening to news from Scandinavia, and in particular Norway, where his illegitimate nephew Magnus Olafsson, known as Magnus the Good, ruled solidly on the throne Harald desired. What followed over the next years was a torrent of betrayals, double-crossing alliances, and treachery. Departing Kievan Rus in 1045, Harald and his men arrived in Sweden early the following year, his ship purportedly unbalanced by the mass hoard of gold stowed aboard. He swiftly allied himself with both Strain Estridsson Ulfsson, royal pretender to the Danish throne, and the new Jacob, the Swedish king, in an alliance aimed at overthrowing King Magnus. Raids began along the coast of Denmark in an attempt at persuading the people that their king had no power to protect them. Fearing the threat of this alliance, Magnus proposed a compromise to Harald, who was already skeptical of Sweyn's allegiances following a botched assassination attempt. That they co-rule the kingdoms at the cost of sharing half of his wealth with his nephew. Their tumultuous co-rule was short-lived, but the period was infused with arguments, suspicions, and violent outbursts whenever the pair met, until Magnus's untimely death from illness in 1047, less than a year into their rule. Without Magnus leaving an heir, Harald swiftly declared himself sole king of Norway and Denmark, despite his late nephew having declared Svein the successor to the Danish throne. What followed was nearly 20 years of bloody conflict between Harald and his erstwhile ally. During these years, Harald also had to contend with internal opposition from the Norwegian aristocracy, threats of rebellion, and the large population of farmers discontented with taxes. It was his brutal and stubborn response to these pressures that earned him the epithet the Hard Ruler. Despite this, historians believe Harald's reign was relatively progressive, introducing viable economic policies, a dedicated Norwegian currency, expanding trade with his contacts in the Byzantine Empire and Kievan Rus, and the development of Christianity throughout the regions. However, as Halvar Tune notes, the reason for this smooth sailing may have been because by 1065, any opposition had either been killed, chased into exile, or silenced, and similarly his absolutism so egotistic that none would dare argue or differ with him. Invasion of England. After grudgingly making peace with Svein in 1064, having failed in his attempts to gain victory over Denmark, Harald received an unexpected proposal the following year from none other than the soon-to-be King England's brother, Earl Tostig Godwinson. Feeling betrayed by his brother, Harold Godwinson, who had sanctioned a rebellion by nobles to oust him from his position of Earl of Northumberland, Tostig was seeking retribution against those who had wronged him and aimed to destabilize Harold's rule. Aligning with a foreign power offered him a bold chance to reclaim his former status and authority, which he could not achieve on his own due to his weakened position in England since his loss of the earldom. Harold, ever the opportunist, also dredged up an old claim to the English throne, one made between the late Magnus and the previous English king, Harthacnut, in 1038. The agreement promised all land and sovereignties to the other in the case of one of their deaths. Yet the English throne had instead passed to Edward the Confessor, who had just died childless and thus left a succession crisis. Duke William of Normandy, bastard son of Robert the Magnificent, also tenuously claimed the throne of England was his and threatened invasion from the south. In the spring of 1066, Harold began assembling his huge fleet, and by September he departed for England with between 10 to 15,000 Vikings aboard nearly 300 longships, intent on knocking King Harold II from his newly ascended throne. Swiftly plundering the east coast of Britain, Harold and his Vikings, now bolstered by Tostig's own men and around 2,000 Scottish allies, terrorized the Northumbrian region, burning down the town of Scarborough and defeating a large English force at the Battle of Fulford on September the 20th, recounted as, quote, "The English lay in the fen, hewn down by the sword, so thickly heaped that they paved a way across the swamp for the brave Norsemen." A decisive victory led to the surrender of York just 4 days later. Now seemingly unstoppable, Harold's army set up camp at nearby Rickel and agreed to meet with the leadership of York the following day to discuss their new rule, unaware that King Harold II had marched his own army to the meeting place. September the 25th, 1066. Idling in camp at Stamford Bridge on the western bank of the Derwent River, Harold had only around 9,000 of his men, believing that they were merely meeting with the citizens from York. The rest of his army had been left at Rickel, around 12 miles distant. Whilst some foraged for food or cleaned equipment and weapons, many of the Vikings had chosen not to wear their mail corselets, possibly because of the heat, shedding a vital piece of protection. It's no wonder that they were stunned to see a cloud of dust and the glint of swords and spears marching towards them just over a mile away. Harold II's army of around 15,000 had marched on foot with full combat equipment, weapons and supplies, an unbelievable 185 miles in just 4 days, up from London where the majority had been garrisoned against the Norman invasion. Godwinson, known for his physical ailments and weak constitution, seemed to be hell-bent on destroying the Viking invaders, supposedly quipping, quote, "I will give him just 6 feet of English soil, or since I hear he is a tall man, I will give him 7. Caught off guard and idle, Harald quickly attempted to assemble his men, ordering a small number of them to carry out a delaying action on the west bank, and withdrawing the rest back over the bridge to the flat east plateau, forming into battle order. This defending force was quickly slaughtered, with some men being drowned in their attempts to flee to the east bank. Godwinson's men surged forward to take the wooden bridge, and it was here that they encountered an epic challenge. An unnamed Viking, said to be of immense stature and strength, stood alone on the bridge, goading the English and hacking down all who attempted to cross in a blood-spattered last stand, supposedly for a large amount of time. Potentially one of the berserkers who fought with no armor, shield or helmet, and in a state of uncontrolled fury, the warrior was finally stopped when surprisingly a local Englishman managed to sneak under the bridge in his swill tub and thrust a spear up between the wooden planks, allowing Godwinson's army to cross. In this final stage of the battle, facing the advancing English army under the banners of Holy Rood, the blood-red dragon of Wessex, Harald sent a messenger to summon the remainder of his men from Rickel, before forming an intimidating shield wall. So followed a prolonged, bloody, close combat battle, with both sides suffering grievous losses, including that of Tostig, yet the Vikings refusing to yield ground. Although we don't have an exact time, at some point Harald was struck in the neck by an arrow, mortally wounding the 51-year-old, who sank to the ground to die in the mud and the guts, and the blood that epitomized his profession. Wavering now, Godwinson feigned retreat and tricked the Vikings into breaking from their shield wall and rushing haphazard to capitalize on the English weakness. Swiftly, the English turned and tore through the invaders, hacking and slashing their way through the routed force. By the time the Viking reinforcements arrived, the battle was lost. Legacy. Having suffered over 5,000 casualties at Stamford Bridge and an exhausting battle on top of the initial 185-mile march, Godwinson then turned his army just mere days later and marched back 240 miles to face William of Normandy's invading forces at the infamous Battle of Hastings on October the 14th. The dreadful outcome of Hastings changed the face of English history, and the defeat is believed to have been in large parts a direct result of Godwinson's prior clash with Harald, sapping his army's strength, resolution, and morale. Renowned as one of the Vikings' greatest warriors, Harald Godwinson ultimately lived up to the age-old moral: live by the sword, die by the sword. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Cheers!